Para continuar con el Congreso, permítanme presentar el siguiente ponencia magistral con el título Panorama de la Industria en Australia, llevada a cabo por Tim Bostridge, director general de Hanover First Australia. Durante los últimos 19 años, Tim Bostridge ha trabajado para algunas de las organizaciones más importantes de la industria de los eventos, como sede tanto en Australia como en el Reino Unido, y ha organizado conferencias y exposiciones alrededor del mundo. Empezó como vendedor de eventos para luego ganar mucha experiencia en posiciones más enfocadas en el contenido antes de fungir como gerente de proyectos de exhibiciones y eventos. Actualmente es director general de Hanover First Australia, una subsidiaria australiana de Deutsche Messe. Se unió a Hanover First Australia en 2016 y lleva 2 años en su posición actual. Hanover First Australia es propietario y operador de 8 marcas de eventos en Australia y Nueva Zelanda. Bienvenido, Tim.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm joining you from Sydney this morning, tomorrow morning on Wednesday, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you about the Australian events industry, give you a bit of an overview of the shape of the industry, the value of the industry to the Australian economy. And then we'll talk a little bit about the arrival of COVID. Obviously, it's a big issue. I'm sure it's been consistent throughout your discussions today. But the impact that that's had on Australia, the Australian events industry, and where we are at the moment and how we're moving forward. So I'm just going to start. I think some of this was in my introduction, but just start with a bit of an overview of Hanover Fair's Australia. So we are obviously the Australian subsidiary of Deutsche Messe. We were established in Australia in the year 2000 when CeBIT Australia was launched. And the business ran CeBIT Australia as its only event really for a number of years before introducing a few smaller conferences and then actually growing the business with some new events and new acquisitions. And we currently run 8 different events in the market here in Australia for a few different verticals. The technology and digital transformation vertical is probably the largest vertical that we serve. And we do that through a variety of different events, one for the HR and learning and development industry, one for the legal industry, and one actually for small to medium businesses, which is a new venture for us just recently. But we also run a large exhibition for the fire and emergency services industry, and we run a CMAT here in Australia, so one for the intralogistics industry. As I said, we're based here in Sydney. We've currently got 17 employees, and these are the different event brands that we have. So some will look perhaps familiar, CMAT, for example, and our AFAC event, which is the fire and emergency services industry, is powered by Interschutz, which are both very big brands, obviously, for our business. A couple of the more unfamiliar looking ones, the HR, L&D, and the legal Tech Fest events. These are relatively new events to our business, which we acquired about 2 years ago, and we have been operating those ever since. We run the HR and L&D event here in Sydney, and we also run one in Auckland in New Zealand. SMB Digital is a sister event with 22X in Hanover, as it suggests, for the small to medium business market and the digital transformation of those businesses. So that's us here in Australia at the moment. So to give you a bit of an overview of the shape of the events industry here in Australia, it's actually a very competitive market. It's very fast moving. There's a lot of innovation here. We've got a mixture of local and multinational event organisers. Some of the more familiar names, obviously, Reed Exhibitions, ourselves, Deutsche Messe, Informa, IQPC. They operate here in Australia. But we also have quite a high number of small and family-run businesses in many instances, all coming together and contributing to the event industry here in Australia. In 2019, there was an estimated 6,754 organisations that were contributing to this industry as a whole, and that's calculated by their membership of some of the key industry bodies that we have here in Australia. And I'll actually talk to a few of the research that's done by those industry bodies, which has kind of tracked Australia's and the industry's progress through the COVID-19 pandemic. So we host here a mixture of locally and globally owned events. We are a destination of choice for many globally rotating events, if you like. So Sydney and Melbourne in particular are often sought after destinations as legs on international event portfolios. They also are a destination of choice for events that rotate around the world and into various different destinations. The business events sector for Australia is significant. In 2019, we had around 950,000 visitors into the country, into the economy, specifically for events, and they contributed just over $4 billion in spend in the year up to March 2020, when obviously the events industry was hit by COVID. This is just to give you a bit of an idea of, I guess, how the events are distributed around the country. So we have very distinct population centres here in Australia. Each state really has one major city destination. Here in New South Wales, obviously it's Sydney. In Victoria, it's Melbourne. In Brisbane, you have, in Queensland, you have Brisbane. South Australia is Adelaide, and in Western Australia, you have Perth. And those are really the main event destinations that organisations seek out to host their events, and also the international events tend to come into those destinations. But the figures, I'm not sure how clear they come out for you, but essentially Sydney and Melbourne occupy around 30% each of the market in terms of events run and delegates attending. And the next biggest market is Brisbane in Queensland with around 17.5%. The rest of the industry is really spread around the country. We have certain industry areas of expertise, if you like. Adelaide has big submarine building capability. It's more of a defence and naval area. And Perth obviously has significant mining and oil and gas resources, so that you end up with a lot of events focused on those issues in those areas. But the real hotspots, I guess, for events in Australia are the Sydney-Melbourne axis. And in normal times, the Sydney-Melbourne flight route is one of the busiest in the world by volume. Some of the core markets that we target as a country to bring into Australia. China is obviously a huge focus. We get a lot of incentive events that come down from China. So incentive events are defined as, I guess, corporate reward, employee reward events where companies will host a number of their staff or employees at special events. We get a lot of that from China. New Zealand is obviously a close partner of Australia and is also a significant contributor to the event scene here. Further afield, North America, the US and Canada is a significant target market, as is Europe, UK, Germany, Italy, France, the major economies there. They bring a lot of event business into Australia. And generally speaking, the association market, we target global events. So any events that might be interested in coming to Australia in hosting their event in Australia is targeted by the convention bureaus which exist in each state. And we actually have a national convention bureau as well that works on bringing business into Australia from a national perspective. So the market here consists of predominantly, this is from a business events perspective, obviously that's our main focus. So the market is divided into exhibitions, which is our main focus as Hanover Fairs Australia, meetings and conventions, which is a significant, probably the largest part of the market, and that incentive market forms the smallest part, but it is a significant makeup of the spend and the, I guess, the direct impact of the visitor economy that rotates around events here in Australia. So in financial year 2019, there was an estimated 484,000 or so events here in Australia, which is significant if you think we're a country of 25 million people. That's a lot of gatherings that are brought together here on our soil. I think we are by nature a very social population, and I think that's reflected in that statistic. The vast majority, as I said, are classified as those meetings and conventions, but the exhibition industry is significant here. The 2,500 exhibitions that were held here in financial year 2019, that equates to around 50 exhibitions a week. And when you think of really only those 5 or 6 main centres where convention centres exist, where the main populations exist, the fight for exhibition space here is very real. In normal times, it is very hard to acquire exhibition space. It's relatively expensive. And you certainly have to plan for your bigger events many years in advance to make sure that you've got that space that you need to deliver your event successfully. So the market here, the value of events in 2019 was calculated at 35.7 billion in direct economic value. So as I say, it's a significant contributor to the Australian economy. Exhibitions contributed around 11% of that, about 4 billion into the economy here. And again, the meetings and convention section was or is by far the biggest contributor out of all of the different angles of the industry. It is estimated that in 2019, we as an industry employed 229,000 people. So that's across all full-time roles in organisations like ours, but obviously there's a lot of casual roles in there as well in terms of hospitality staff that help to deliver the event within venues, people that help to build the exhibitions, the tradespeople that come in and all play a big part in the overall ecosystem of the events here. But it's a big employer, and we contribute around 11.1 billion under normal circumstances, $11.1 billion worth of wages into the economy on an annual basis. Just to break that down a little bit further for you, and to have a look at some of the individual sectors, if you like, and what they contribute. So, as I say, meetings and conventions, by far the largest, around 31 million attendees to our events over the course of a year. Spending just shy of 30 billion in direct spending. So a really big contributor there to the economy. Exhibitions are by far the largest event in terms of the event type on a per event basis. So exhibitions are relatively expensive to run, and we also attract a significant number of attendees per event. About $1.5 million there in terms of direct expenditure per event. That would probably be for some of the larger exhibitions that run, but it goes to show that the direct expenditure across the whole ecosystem there is pretty significant from exhibitions. And in terms of the attendance per event, it averages out to around 4,500 people per exhibition. So they're not massive on a Hanover scale. We don't run into the hundreds of thousands here. The average floor space within a convention centre is probably between 15 to 35,000 square metres. So you can get an idea of the kind of scale of the events that we would run. The biggest exhibitions here, you'd probably be looking at around 450, 500 exhibitors, and perhaps 20 to 30,000 visitors. So that tends to be the largest in terms of scale that we deliver here in Australia. That incentive market, it's the smallest in terms of overall contribution, but it's the largest in terms of direct spend per attendee, which is probably a reflection of the fact that when people are organising this type of event, they tend to be a lot more lavish, a lot more in terms of sparing no expense. They're certainly not run on the sort of profit motive that the majority of exhibitions and some of the corporate events are run on. So as you can see, it's a significant increase in the average spend per attendee. So prior to COVID, the market here was growing very strongly. The number of business events in Australia grew from 412,000 in financial year 2014 to the 484,000 that we experienced here in 2019. That's around a 17% growth in the events held over that time. And within that growth, there was significant growth in the direct contribution into the market as well. So business events in Australia, whilst they increased by 17% in number, we actually added 27.5% growth in direct economic contribution. So that grew by 7.7 billion from 28 billion in 2014 through to the 35.7 billion that we reported in 2019. That is also reflected in the, I guess, the additional economic impact through indirect spending for events. And that grew by 3.7 billion from 13.5 billion in 2014 to 17.2 billion in 2019. So I hope that gives you a bit of a feel for, I guess, the shape of the industry here, what constitutes or what comprises the industry here in Australia. It certainly was a very successful part of the Australian economy, and it was a big part of I guess, the way of life over here. As with in many places around the world, the arrival of COVID changed a great deal. It really shook things up, certainly in terms of our general lives, but also in terms of the industry. So just to give you an idea of, I guess, the journey that we've had here with COVID, Australia saw its first case on the 25th of January 2020. It was on a flight from China originally, and we responded initially by postponing travel to that region. But then, obviously, as it spread globally, we actually took the decision to close the international borders here in Australia, and we have remained closed. So international borders closed on the 19th of March, and we've been closed off effectively to all international travel apart from returning residents or citizens for the past 15 months. So that's had a huge impact on the tourism industry. As you can imagine, here in Australia, tourism is a massive part of the economy. It's also impacted the universities sector. One of the largest contributors to the Australian economy is actually international students studying here in Australia. But it's had a fairly positive impact, I guess, in terms of the overall journey that we've had here. So we've been relatively lucky in terms of the impact of the virus. We've recorded just over 30,000 cases to date, with just the loss of 910 lives, which, although it's obviously tragic, it's in comparison to the many places around the world, it's a relatively low total. So we have managed that through mandatory quarantine for anyone that returns. We have 14 days mandatory quarantine in a government-managed hotel system. So anyone that flies into the country gets taken direct from the airport to a government-managed hotel, and they remain there for 14 days until they are able to release and be released and assume normal life. You get tested on day 3, on day 10, and then again when you leave on day 16. So it's a really rigorous process that they've introduced, and that has so far helped us to manage certainly infections within the community, and maintain a relatively normal pace of life here in Australia across these rather incredible times. So globally, we've been reported as being a relatively successful handler of the pandemic, but as we move into the phase now where a lot of the world is opening up, it throws up a number of challenges for us in terms of how we reopen the economy, and how we've got very used to having 0 cases on a daily basis. So at some stage, we will need to obviously reopen the borders and get used to COVID being amongst us. As I think we all understand, moving forward, it will become part of our lives. The vaccination program here has been relatively slow on an international scale. I guess the urgency hasn't been there, and we also haven't been a priority for doses to be sent here from overseas. We've got it's freely available. At the moment, the program is vaccinating everyone down to the age of 40 using a combination of the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer or BioNTech vaccines. As you can see, this number was taken a few days ago, but we're around 23% of the population has had their first dose, but a very low 2.5% is now fully vaccinated. So around 6.5 million doses have been given out, but that's nowhere near where we need to be, which would be effectively 50 million doses, I guess, to see the population fully vaccinated. And in response to that, the government is currently stating that our international borders will remain closed until mid-2022, so a further 12 months from now, which would really have, I guess, significant ramifications for us as a nation. And whilst we've weathered the initial part of the pandemic relatively well, the economy did go into recession, but it has recovered from that recession in the recent quarter. I think we will continue to bump along until we can reopen to the rest of the world and assume, I guess, our place as an international destination of choice. In terms of the events industry, and I'm sure this has been reflected where you are, certainly I know it's been reflected in many countries around the world. So 96% of business events scheduled in 2020 were either postponed or cancelled. So that came at a loss of 1.153 million event days in 2020. And the sector's projected to have lost between $29.4 and $35.7 billion in the 15 months to March 2020. So that's essentially, if you think back to the figures we spoke about earlier, it's essentially an entire year of direct contribution to the Australian economy from our industry that was lost. Staffing levels obviously fell in line with this drop in business. So if you think from the 229,000 that were employed in 2019, we lost 92, just over 92,000 to the 6 months to June 2020 after the first cases were detected. So this table on this slide here is it's actually from the Business Events Council of Australia's analysis on the business that was lost as a result of the pandemic. The figures are slightly different. It's a smaller sample size, but the impact I thought just sort of highlighted exactly what happened. So from January to March, there was a small round of job losses as people kind of adjusted to the fact that this probably was going to have an impact on us. But that then accelerated into June 2020 when it became clear that this wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, and there was some very strong job cuts. Events were cancelled, as in completely cancelled off the schedule, not to return, and portfolios were taken out of businesses, and staff went with them. So it was a very difficult time here. The government stepped in and created a program called JobKeeper, which was effectively a wage subsidy to pay wages of staff up to a certain amount to keep them working and keep them within businesses. And that was largely successful in keeping people employed in this industry anyway. So what did we do? As many of you have done, we pivoted to virtual. We ran, as a business here, we ran 4 events, 4 of our portfolio as virtual events. And I think that, obviously there were some events that lend themselves better to the virtual environment than others, and that was seen across the industry as a whole. So the majority of people did pivot to virtual. 79% of businesses ran some form of virtual event, whether that was a new launch event or running an existing event as virtual. But 20% of businesses stopped entirely. And I had a conversation with one of the heads of another of Australia's exhibition industry businesses, and he said, you know, I just don't want to go down that path, and we're going to wait it out. And that was a brave move. We are back to running some events this year, but it's by no means smooth sailing. And I think that the industry has been well supported by virtual. It's certainly helped to generate revenue and cash flow during difficult times, and it's helped to keep us connected with our communities that are key for supporting our events when we do get back to face-to-face. There were some positive outcomes. 81% of businesses reported higher attendance at in-person events, and 40% actually saw a higher ROI, which I assume is because the cost base was lower. So relative to the revenue generated, the ROI was calculated as greater. Certainly in our experience, it is harder to generate the same levels of revenue in a virtual environment as it is in a face-to-face environment. But not all good news. So some businesses reported it was much harder to hit KPIs running virtual events. They certainly reduced their event volumes, as we did as a business. And 41% of businesses reported a lower satisfaction level in running those events. I think we certainly found that running a virtual event meant, if anything, more work. And we were certainly learning a new skill as we went along. So we move into more up to where we are now in 2021, and it's been a much more positive experience so far this year to date. So many of the gathering restrictions here in Australia have been lifted. The restrictions are managed on a state basis, not on a federal basis, so there are some nuances between different regions, but generally speaking, the industry is open. We are able to operate events in most of the major centres on a 1 person per 2 square metre basis. All events have to have a very strict COVID safe plan, and contact tracing is really I guess the cornerstone of Australia's response to any outbreak. So you have to QR scan into events, you have to QR scan into shops, and so you record your attendance in various different locations. And in the event of an outbreak, you're contacted, requested to go and have a test and isolate to manage that outbreak. So in terms of our events, it's a key part of that plan is to make sure that we know who is in our event and when. In the event that an outbreak does occur, we're able to contact them and help authorities to manage those outbreaks. So whilst events are open, almost all events are delivered in some form of hybrids like we are doing here today. Whether that's delegates attending remotely, speakers contributing from overseas, like I'm doing with yourselves, or even exhibitor booths. We actually, this is an image from an event that we ran in Auckland a couple of weeks ago. This is a virtual booth. It's an event in Auckland being contributed to by a company in Singapore. So people from Singapore are not allowed to travel to New Zealand. We in Australia can travel to New Zealand. That's the one travel bubble that exists for us, the one opportunity for international travel that we have. So we connected them into the exhibition to run their contribution remotely. And there have been some successful events. IQPC ran their healthcare week, 4,000 visitors, around 170 exhibitors. ETF ran a national 4x4 show at the Brisbane Showgrounds with 25,000 visitors. And Fire Australia, which is an association-based event, ran an event here in Sydney with 2,500 visitors, a slightly smaller exhibitor base there. In just a few weeks ago, and there was a bit of an outbreak whilst that was running, and they were able to maintain the operation of the event and deliver a successful program, which was great to see. So there's some real green shoots. Sentiment is recovering. Organisers are slowly coming back, but there are still concerns out there. So these figures are from Business Events Australia and Tourism Australia. They do like a a quarterly business sentiment in the events industry survey. So this shows that this is the latest one from May. So up to May, 50% effectively of businesses that normally run events had started to run events again. 50% were still waiting to, but had plans to. There was only a very small number that really said, no, we're still not back, we're still not happy with it. And in terms of some of the sentiments or the factors that are influencing that sentiment, the COVID travel restrictions, even within Australia, between different states, is having a real impact on our industry here, as well as obviously health concerns around the virus itself. Virtual and hybrid events are still very much part of people's plans here. I think it's quite interesting that 23% still think virtual is a big part of the mix going forward, even though you can run face-to-face events, and that is reflected in the fact that the majority of companies are looking to run face-to-face events, 61%. 16% are looking at a hybrid. I suspect that that's probably the current events later in the year. People are, I think, hoping that we will be back to fully face-to-face, and any sort of hybrid elements will be like this, a remote speaking engagement. But some companies are preparing for a strong return. So 84% say that their domestic events budget is the same in the next 12 months as it was in 2018, 2019. And 82% of big companies feel that their attendance levels will be the same as in that time as well. Our experience is that currently around 60-70% of 2019 is achievable, and we're hoping that will raise to the 80 to 90% level as we get further through the year. So confidence is growing. 7 in 10 businesses are saying that they will exhibit or support exhibitions in some way, shape or form, which is fantastic. And really only 17% are saying that they're going to contribute to less events this year. So 57% saying they'll contribute to more, 25% saying they'll contribute to the same, and just a small element saying that actually they'll probably do less events this year, in the coming year. And uncertainty around travel restrictions and rolling border closures is definitely a main reason for that. 54% are still citing concerns related to the virus. But interestingly, 32% of companies saying they're not going to do as many shows are saying that they're going to switch to virtual, which may be international shows as well. Most importantly, though, confidence is growing. The sector is slowly hiring back the staff that were lost in that sort of March and June period of last year. I think the pandemic's shown that nothing will ever replace face-to-face contact, but it's certainly shown here in Australia that technology can play a role, and probably will play a role in the events industry moving forward. But intention is growing. 83% of businesses now are saying that they're going to run the same number of events next year as they did in 2019. And I think that's a fantastic sign here in Australia. I hope it's the same with you in Mexico, and I hope it's the same around the world as well. So it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. I hope this has been of value and you've got a good feeling for the events industry here in Australia. We hope that we'll see many of you here in Australia at some point in the future. I wish you all the best for the rest of the event and a successful conference.
Tim. Thank you very much, Tim, for your presentation. It was very helpful. Muchas gracias a Tim por su valiosa aportación sobre el panorama de los eventos en Australia. Ahora, para terminar con nuestro